Hello and welcome to the SlimAI virtual booth at KubeCon. I'm delighted to say that I'm joined again by Kyle Quest, our CTO, and also Kelsey Hightower. Sorry about that. Thank you very much for joining us.
We have the nice conference background. I love it. It makes it more real.
It really does. Yeah, Kyle has the benefit of being there in person, where we've both been attending virtually this year.
Exactly. Look, I'm super interested on what you've been seeing. So typically I'm there every year. You walk the floors, and there's always
Mhm.
some big themes that pop out. I guess Kyle, what are some of the big things? I've seen some few things on Twitter, but what are you seeing on the floor over there?
There's a number of interesting themes. KubeCon is big in terms of the tracks and different mini conferences. There's a bunch of day zero events, more than ever. And I'd say, three major themes that I really connected with, and they're pretty major. One is security, with a big focus around supply chain security and SBOM. Another one is observability the easy way. The easy way meaning that you don't explicitly instrument the applications, and there, people are interested in leveraging service meshes for that, and eBPF. There's actually the first ever eBPF day at KubeCon, and there were lots of interesting talks there, and I contributed a little bit, but we can talk more about that later. And then developer experience. I think that's a big one, because Kubernetes is complicated, and especially for developers. And when it comes to cloud native and the cloud native infrastructure in general, it is complicated, and there's always a lot of challenges that developers have to deal with. It's just overwhelming. So these are awesome themes because they align pretty well with where we're trying to focus. Developer experience, because we're trying to leverage application knowledge to empower developers to build
So
and
let's talk
deliver.
about the security
Yeah.
component. I've been working on something like this internally at Google Cloud, of course. We put out this salsa framework about, thinking about the end-to-end
Mhm.
security supply chain. And I know you mentioned SBOM, so I know there's probably people watching like, what the hell is SBOM, right? So this software bill of materials. If you think
Mhm.
about people who write code, you write code and you just pull in dependencies.
Yep.
It's like baking a cake and not knowing what the ingredients are. Like you're allergic to
Mhm.
shellfish, and someone created a shrimp cake, and you're like,
Yep.
why is there shrimp in this cake? And you won't know until you bite into it. So I think really what most people are looking for now is like, look, there should be like nutritional facts for our software. And I think this whole SBOM movement is around saying, look, we got to do a little bit better. If you're going to be pulling in third-party dependencies from, random places. I know when I started, you had a Linux distribution, you did apt-get install or yum install, and at least you knew where it came from. It was signed by someone. It was built in a consistent way. So I think now it sounds like a lot of people are trying to bring probably user experience to that world of leveraging some of the SBOM standards. Is that what you're seeing? Or I would imagine since it's KubeCon, there's like 500 startups coming out of stealth with some
Exactly.
SBOM. So
There's a bunch of tools producing as bombs, and one of the things that happens is about kind of connecting the dots, taking the tools, kind of the open source tools and the commercial tools, and connecting that, because it's not enough to produce an S bomb. You need to leverage it in a way that makes sense, and that means you need to have an assurance that the recipe, the ingredients you're looking at are the actual ingredients. So you need to be able to sign all of that. That's where all other set of tools come in, with Six Store and others. And then obviously there's the user experience perspective, because if it's too complicated to use, nobody's going to use it. And that's kind of connecting those three things together. And I think there's a lot of interest in it, and there's a number of talks kind of sharing experiences around that. For example, there was an effort to generate SBOM for Kubernetes itself. So that was quite a process.
I would
So,
imagine that SBOM metadata was
yeah.
probably like a gig at least. of
Yeah.
probably random XML trying to figure out what those things are. Did anyone successfully do it?
Oh yeah. That were pretty successful. It's just taking that and make it accessible to the average developer, a web developer who's not an expert in all of those low-level tools, and that's one of the challenges. That's why I mentioned the developer experience theme, because it's not enough to have a tool that or a set of tools that allow you to do something. If it's too complicated, most people will not do it, and it's not going to be adopted. And the
So I have a quick question. What does SlimAI play in this, right? So, when I think about this SBOM generation component, number one, you need some build tools, you need some
Yep.
introspection tools. And my guess is if you want to go even deeper, you might even need to run that thing to see what it's like dynamically linking to, if we want to go that deep in terms of what this
Yeah.
thing will ultimately do. For those that haven't played with SlimAI, I know I kicked the tires a little bit. Is SlimAI going to be able to produce something like this? Is this where you see DockerSlim tools like that jumping into the game as well?
So there's a couple of things to what's going on and where we're trying to focus. Right now, what we're seeing is the basic kind of supply chain security and the basic SBOM efforts. And basic, I mean generating an SBOM for a container image, which is nice, which is a nice stepping stone. But it's a global list, and it's actually not sufficient, because what you really want is an application-specific SBOM, because what's good as a component for one application is not good as a component for another application. So
So let's
that's
pull on that thread for a second. I know some people like it's all about the container image, and if you're like most people, you're like pull from Ubuntu, app get install the internet, and then you drop in your half a byte of source code, and you're only linking to a fraction of that stuff, or even using it to do your build. Is this about making something that's like super clean and relevant versus listing a bunch of stuff that may or may not even be in the execution path?
Yeah, exactly. That's a big part of it, and that's a part of that application-centric approach. It's kind of a traditional, similar to the traditional vulnerability management problem. You scan a container image, you produce a Christmas tree of vulnerabilities, but you don't know which ones are relevant. So the same needs to happen with SBOM and the bill of material. We need the application-specific information, and again, some component might be useful for one app and not and could be a sign of something malicious for another app. So that's huge. And what we also need is more context behind those components. And that's also where we're focusing, providing more visibility, more context, and then we're planning to tie it all together to the SBOM and the signing tools that are available, to providing richer and more contextual information, kind of going from the basic information that we're seeing emerging to more application-centric and more contextual.
And for those that are not familiar with the Christmas tree piece, it's when you just scan things and things turn yellow, red, and green. And sometimes you just don't even know what they are and just try to make them all turn green. So that is kind of the primitive way to think about scanning container images or some type of build artifact. So, the Christmas tree works. I mean, I guess if you make everything turns green, you could say Christmas came early, but really the truth is you want to be packaging only the things that actually matter. So we used to have this saying, ship applications, not build environments, right? We don't want to be shipping things that are just used at build time. We want to ship things that are for the application. I have a question around the developer stuff. Every year at KubeCon, there's like two groups of people. Those that complain about YAML and those yet to complain about YAML. And we always talk about developer experience. And I've always contended that Kubernetes is not a developer platform. It's a platform for building platforms. And so when I hear people saying they want to improve the developer experience, number one, at the very lowest level, I don't know if it's possible in terms of like making YAML easier to write, which is like the assembly of Kubernetes. So when I hear this, I'm thinking, oh, someone wants to build a new platform on top of Kubernetes that attempts for the 7,000th time to abstract Kubernetes away. Is that what you're seeing? You're seeing kind of like another theme around people making a lightweight platform as a service on top?
There's a number of talks about serverless on top of Kubernetes, Knative, for example, and those kind of abstractions. I haven't seen anything new in terms of the discussions compared to other years. So there's more discussions around that, and then the tooling. For example, tooling like templating, creating templates for applications. So you don't write one from scratch, but you leverage a template.
And when we say template, are we still talking about generating YAML files?
Yeah, kind of related to that, and then also using tools like KO with Kubernetes. There's there's KO and Jib and all of that help you with KO. You can build Go applications for Kubernetes easier, and all of that. So it's about building additional tooling, and that's where we also want to focus and trying to focus. We're not trying to introduce a new interface. We're trying to fill a gap with that you get traditionally with DevOps, not just related to Kubernetes, but with pretty much anything. Where you're building modern apps, you have the cloud infrastructure on one end, and you have the application, and then there's a gap between those two, where you have to do a lot of manual work, and it's developers, it's DevOps engineers, and all of that. It's time-consuming and complicated. Developers themselves can't really do enough because they're not infrastructure experts. So what we want to do, we want to capture the application information and automate these things in the middle, in that gap, where you no longer have to do things the hard way and manually. And like one of the...
I mean, when do we get back to when a developer just says, look, I'm going to check in my code.
Yep.
I give you just enough metadata. You produce an artifact, and we deploy it. I get all this other stuff. It's cool. Yep. We have 700,000 tools to choose from. But when do we get to the point where it's like, look, we've been doing this for a long time. We've been talking about best practices since I joined the industry. When do we get to the point where I can just say, here's my app, very minimal metadata? How far are we away from that?
So we're actually pretty close in some ways. There's build packs, for example, that take the concept from the original concepts behind the PaaS environments like Heroku, where you provide the code and behind the scene they package it and then they deploy it. So it's taking that concept and exposing the internals of that. And that's actually one of the problems with that, is that the build pack construct is an internal construct, and it solves one problem, but it introduces another problem when you're using it. So it's great. You can point a build pack tool at your application. It'll create a container image that's deployable and all of that. But what you end up with is a little difficult and rough around the edges if you kind of go beyond the happy path, and also you end up with something you have no idea what you have. You end up with this kind of opaque blob that's something generated, and if something is broken there, it's going to be quite complicated to.
So are you saying build packs are not the solution?
No. I'm just saying that the build packs in their current form is not enough on their own. It's a building block. But it's a low-level building block that needs to be integrated with an end-to-end flow, and kind of, for example, you trade off visibility for convenience, but something needs to bring back the visibility. And for example, that's what Slim does. You generate those. You use build pack. Okay.
So virtual events. What any good talks? Give me some notable talks that I should go check out.
Well, what's been interesting is we've been doing a sequence of events, through these booths during the course of the event, And it's actually feedback from those that has been most interesting to me. So one of our colleagues, Aisha, prepared a deep dive analysis into approximately the top most impactful 130 containers. And this sort of ties in with what Kyle was touching on earlier about sort of observability and developer experience. And I think the thing that highlighted to us most interestingly is the amount of dev tools that are being shipped into production is quite astonishing. And also, because those dev tools tend to be quite sticky, people aren't iterating on uplifting those often, and they seem to represent a significant attack surface in these containers, where there are not many vulnerabilities, but the impact of the vulnerabilities that exist in those containers through that tooling is quite significant. And obviously, this also then explodes the size of the containers, and that slows down developer velocity. And this is, something that, we are trying to work very hard at. Carl's talked about finding the happy path for developers, helping them use container best practices. And, the feedback we
This seems
get.
like an area where we saw the convenience problem, right? When I used to write Ruby back in the day, we were using tools like RVM to manage our, dim files and keep these things isolated between different apps I was working on. And I remember when Go came out, it was like you can just create a statically linked binary. Everything goes into that. And then you're just shipping this one thing around. And I think Go even went so far as to do its own libc implementation. So you didn't even link out dynamically to what was on the OS. So you kind of have the sense that this binary is somewhat everything, right? I can ship that around and I can rebuild this one thing. And then I remember people just going and saying, well, instead of doing something similar for other languages, we were like, how about we just put everything in a container image and call it good? And it seems like 10 years later, we're still shipping around all of this stuff, and we've never really solved the root cause problem, which is some of these runtimes may need a more advanced build system that can create these kind of everything I need and nothing more artifacts versus assuming people will do, bringing in all these dependencies from all these different sources at runtime.
Indeed. And of course, some of what you talk about there, providing those sort of specialist libraries inside the containers, that's always not a panacea either. One of the other things that we've observed is that using Alpine can give you a small starting point in terms of your base image size, but then there's additional considerations, such as developers may not be familiar with Alpine. It's a new way of working with your container. And because of things like Muscle, which is designed to be small and compact, you can actually incur unexpected performance penalties. So when you make the transition, suddenly you have an application performance penalty that you didn't anticipate. And then that's friction and loss of velocity and momentum. And so, by using DockerSlim, for example, you can stick with a familiar sort of general purpose distro as your base and then minify that by stripping out the unnecessary developer tools, but keeping all of that developer familiarity. So you can have fat containers instrumented with lots of developer tooling, but then minify those down as they go into production to sort of pull all of that stuff away.
And that was the original developer experience principle behind DockerSlim. Why I wanted to have it, because all other solutions ask you to change things, and I just wanted to keep my tools that I had, my base images, and how the images were structured and all of that, and that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to keep everything I had, and I wanted to get the good outcomes I needed with as little manual work as possible.
So I think for today, these tools like DockerSlim that take a really big kind of bloated starting point and make it smaller, I'm still holding out hope that the actual language runtimes get much better at just saying, I'm going to build only the things I need and strip away everything not required for this to run. That might be 20 years from now.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm hoping that, whether it's Rust, I think Go's done a good job kind of leading the way there. but I do know what's possible in these other runtimes. And so I'm hoping that, long term, we get to a point where, tools like DockerSlim, provide kind of this blueprint of like, hey, here's what build systems should be capable of.
Yeah,
Hey, I
right
wanted
now.
to pivot to the observability stuff.
Mhm.
Over the years, there's always about Prometheus and structured logging and, tools like Zipkin for tracing. But you mentioned earlier that people are saying, hey, and I remember, working with some of the Pixie Lab folks where they were using eBPF to try to just make all this stuff automated, no sidecars, no instrumentation in the app. And they would just kind of pull this from the kernel. It sounds like people are double down on that now. Is that what's happening?
Yeah, it's going mainstream. It's going mainstream for a number of reasons. Because doing it the hard way, you mentioned, is something that's, well, hard. It's a lot of work, and people realize that there's not enough adoption. So with eBPF maturing in the current kernels, it becomes more practical to use it. And now we're also talking about continuous profiling, where we're constantly collecting the telemetry, and then we're leveraging that. We have that at the network level, at the system level. One of the pre-KubeCon announcement around Parker, for example, they introduced, well, that's the tool name. They do continuous profiling where they're always collecting events in Kubernetes. So it's getting more traction where you don't directly instrument, but you instrument through the runtime environment, and that makes it easy for the applications and for the observability tools, because it's a lot less to deal with. Yeah, but the challenge with eBPF is the kernel support. And when you have server environments, you don't always get and especially different environments, you don't always get the right kernel. And now it's getting to a point where the right components are in place. For example, the laptop I'm using right now is about from a year and a half ago, and it still uses Ubuntu 18.04, and it didn't have BTF, which is one of those important components for eBPF enabled. A half a year later, Dell started shipping laptops with Ubuntu 2010 with BTF enabled, which is a big part of having this ability to compile eBPF programs once and then using them in other environments. Because one of the current problems, historical problems with the BPF, is that you had to ship the compiler to each node where you had to run eBPF, because you had to have the exact headers on that machine. Otherwise, the eBPF program would crash. For example, the task structure in the kernel changes a lot, and from one version to another. So that's why you had to ship the compiler, and you had to build the eBPF program on the node and before you could use it. And there's a performance problem there as well, but that's one of the usability problems that's being solved right now. That's why eBPF is becoming mainstream, because the ability to compile once and run everywhere is becoming a reality.
All right, I got about 5 minutes before I got to go to another meeting. But, if I were to, if you had like 2 or 3 talks that I should go watch, which ones do you think really stand out this year?
So one of my favorite talks is the talk about registries. It's called Registries After Dark. And what they did, they explored the registries and OCI and what you can store in registries. And registries are not only about images. You can have different media type and different data stored there. And that's actually something that's being leveraged for the supply chain security and SBOM, where you can integrate that information into registries. But what they did, instead of doing that, which is kind of boring because everybody else is doing it, they used registries as a chat server. So they ended up dynamically generating image layers for chat messages. and then you would get these continuously evolving images that you would pull to get the older messages, and then there's a real-time component. That's pretty cool.
So we're turning Docker Hub into a global distributed Slack platform. Is that what we're doing?
Yeah. So it's fun. I mean, registries are boring, and in a way, it's because there has been enough innovation there, but these guys made it fun. So that was fun. They talk about six store, how we started, where we are, and where we're headed is also interesting. And they start by talking about Let's Encrypt and what Let's Encrypt did for certificates, and where there's an opportunity to do that for supply chain and SBOM and all of that. So that's interesting as well. So I'd say these two talks are good.
Okay.
I enjoyed those.
From my point of view, there's been a couple of talks on developer burnout, which I think melds quite nicely with the whole conversation about developer experience. Some years ago, we were hearing the sort of the warnings about there are not enough developers to service the software engineering work that needs to be done, and there are not enough new developers entering the global job market. Even when you take into account the huge influx of developers each year through China and India, there's still not enough developers to keep pace with their ever-growing demands. So this whole sort of developer experience movement, even outside of KubeCon, I'm seeing as an overall growing trend in the industry about helping developers to work smarter and healthier. By not loading them up with new tooling, but having that tooling be intelligent to actually make a meaningful impact on their momentum and velocity.
Yeah, the thing about being a developer that I think is hard is that you're never finished.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that as a human, when we do work or a task, we like to be able to step back and say it's done. But with software development, you're just never done. It feels like every brick that you lay, someone changes the floor plan. And so I think when we talk about developer experience, we have to talk about the very human nature of we're asking people to run a marathon with no finish line. And so, we have to really get creative about what it means to take a break, switch to something else, stop running for a while. So I think that's where we're going to have to probably move away from just solving this with another IDE plugin and start thinking about what do humans actually need to, recover. Most times a professional athlete needs downtime. There's an off season. So hopefully one day maybe people will start exploring things outside of technology fixes and really hone into the thing that makes us human. Hey, look, this has been a really dope update. I know SlimAI, you guys got all this registry cool tooling, and DockerSlim, I think people are now rediscovering it, especially as we all kind of focus on secure software supply chain. So hopefully people start incorporating that in their pipelines. Thanks for the update. I got to run, but thanks for having
Thanks
me and
very
giving me the
much.
quick update.
Thanks,
Thank you for
Kelsey.
joining us.
Later.
And I'll just turn your camera off there, Kelsey. But thank you very much.
Thank you.
And Kyle, just very quickly, so we were streaming most of this to Twitch. I'm going to let those people that are watching us on Twitch and those people that are still watching, we're on twitch.tv/SlimDevOps. We're going to be taking a short break, and then I will be returning in about half an hour with my colleague Josh Vinny, who's head of product at SlimAI, and we're going to be looking at the SlimAI product roadmap and sort of segue with that last point, what we're doing to try and help and address developer problems and issues. So in about half an hour, we'll be back here on Twitch, and I hope some of you will be able to join us. Anything you want to add before we sign off, Kyle?
We talked about it a lot, but I want to kind of go back to a couple of analogies that I like using. Right now, there's so much going on building cloud-native applications, and a lot of it feels like working with assembly. Back in the day when you had to write applications in assembly, these days you will never even think about writing a web application in assembly. So that's where we need to get to. And we're still writing assembly infrastructure, cloud native infrastructure assembly. It doesn't have to be that way. It's too hard. It requires you to know too much, and it's a lot of manual work. And that's what we want to address with SlimAI and the application-centric approach that we're leveraging.
Yeah. Excellent. Right. Well, thank you all very much for attending, and thank you, Kyle. We'll call it there, and hopefully we'll see some of you back here in about half an hour. So
Sounds
thanks,
good.
and see you soon. I need to push the right buttons and everything.